Okay, so tonight we're pleased to welcome Bill Deen, president of the Friends of the Bedford Depot, with a program on the White Pass and Yukon Railroad. The presentation will focus on a 3-day charter that Bill wrote in September 2024 that covered the 67 miles of the railroad still in service. Featured were original WP&Y 282 number 73 and unusual 6-axle diesels from 3 manufacturers. Supplementing that will be a few views from a single-day steam charter in July of 1982 that went the entire distance from Skagway to Whitehorse. The railroad was still intact then and in its final months as a year-round common carrier. Bill's book detailing the history of the Boston and Maine's Lexington branch, Minuteman Railroad, was published last year. Bill's done several programs for us over the past few years, and they've all been wonderful. So, Bill, welcome back, and let's go to Alaska.
Let's head to the north. Before I start showing you pictures of my 2 trips to the White Pass and Yukon, 40 years apart, I think maybe a little bit of orientation would be helpful. If you look at the maps on the left, the railroad runs from Skagway, originally all the way to Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory, crossing a corner of British Columbia in between. It was built as a rush job during the spectacular Klondike Gold Rush starting in 1898. And it terminated in Whitehorse because Whitehorse is the head of navigation of the Yukon River. And from there, the prospectors could continue by river steamboat the approximately 500 miles farther north to Dawson, where the gold was. So the Whitehorse was a sort of the key middle part of the journey. Of course, the first part was an ocean trip from a Pacific Coast port like Vancouver and Seattle to Skagway. So the railroad was built in all possible speed during the Klondike Gold Rush, but when it was finished in 1900, the gold rush was essentially over, and the railroad settled into an ordinary day-to-day existence. Didn't buy a new steam locomotive between 1908 and 1938, but continued to serve the mining and other aspects of the economy of the Yukon. That quiet period ended abruptly with Pearl Harbor and the Japanese attack on the Aleutian Islands, which led to the decision that an inland route to the north was essential for national security, and the Whitehorse terminal of the White Pass was a natural staging point for constructing what became the Alaska Highway. The freight traffic doubled and then doubled again and doubled again. The U.S. Army came in, leased the railroad, brought in about 25 new or used steam locomotives, hundreds of pieces of rolling stock, and basically ran the railroad 24/7, supplying materials for the Alaska Highway and the military bases in the north. Things settled down then after the war, but the 50s for the White Pass were a time of innovation, and during that time, the White Pass developed North America's first integrated container system, multimodal container system, including highway, rail, and ocean shipping. During that time, they also dieselized, and that was completed around 1965. The freight ante went up considerably in 1969 with the opening of what became an enormous open pit lead zinc mine at a place called Faro in the Yukon Territory, about 100 miles or so north of Whitehorse. The prospective mine traffic was so great that the White Pass basically mortgaged its future against that, rebuilt its bridges, rebuilt much of its track, doubled its diesel roster, and through dredging and filling created a new export ore terminal in the Skagway harbor. That lasted until 1982, when with about 1 month's notice, the mine shut down. And it appeared then that that would be the end of the railroad. But in 1988, the management took the chance that maybe they could operate the railroad not anymore as a all-year common carrier, but as a summer tourist railroad. People had been coming to Skagway to ride the railroad almost from the beginning, just to see the scenery and enjoy the train ride. That had increased during the 1930s with people arriving through on traditional coastal steamers, some of which were operated by the Canadian Pacific or Canadian National. And that had gradually become a significant contributor to the bottom line of the railroad. But the question in 1980s was, would it be enough for the railroad to survive? Well, fast forwarding to this past summer, a time when cruise ships have increased in number and size, and there's sometimes 2 or even 3 international cruise ships in dock at Skagway. On such a day, the railroad was running 9 departures from Skagway up to the summit and beyond, 15 cars per train, daily capacity of almost 6,000 passengers. 1988, the first year of the passenger revival, 6,000 was the total that they carried for that whole year. And I gather they almost sort of broke even that year, and now they carry that many in a day. So the White Pass has finally, I guess, achieved the prosperity that it had been hoped for, all along, and is by some margin the most popular tourist railroad in North America. As Dave mentioned, I'll be showing you pictures from 2 trips. One was a railfan charter last September run by Chris Scow. It's a 3-day charter with plenty of photo stops, varying itineraries and varying power. We stayed at a hotel in Whitehorse and were bused to and from that to places on the railroad that we were starting. The map on the left is better than the first one I showed you, and it'll provide a little bit more geographical orientation. Skagway to the White Pass summit, which is also the international boundary, is about 20 miles, climb of just under 3,000 feet. The next 20 miles on the railroad is the descent going north to Bennett, British Columbia. So the first 40 miles is the sort of the mountainous part of the railroad. Beyond that, it's water level, about a 30-mile run along the very long and narrow Lake Bennett to a place called Carcross, which is strategically positioned at an inlet between Lake Bennett and Tagish Lake, and is now the operational north terminal of the railroad. From Carcross, the approximately 40 miles to Whitehorse has not seen a train in many years, is partly dismantled and probably will never see a train again. But I will be turning the clock back to 1982 and show you a bit of what Whitehorse and the northern end of the railroad looked like back in the final months of the railroad as a year-long common carrier. There'll be lots of action shots involving White Pass Mikado number 73, the last engine bought by the railroad. It's never left the property, but also 3 generations of diesels, all of which have examples that are still operable. The railroad was dieselized with 11 so-called shovel nose units custom built for it by GE starting in 1954. These had the very heavily reinforced slanted front ends for bucking snow, and they had air and exhaust handling systems to allow them to operate at temperatures as low as 50 below. With a lead zinc mining boom in the late 60s came 10 more conventional Alco road switchers built at Montreal. And then in the last 4 years, the railroad has switched its tourist trains over to some high horsepower units built by National Railway Equipment. So let's go back to the charter in September, and I'll do this chronologically. There'll be 3 days, and the first day was our all Alco day, starting at Carcross, which was milepost 67.5 measured from Skagway, and the current north end of the operational part of the railroad. The coaches we had that day were newish steel coaches built to closely resemble and I think very nicely match the traditional passenger equipment the railroad still has. There's a few of them there pulling into the onto the platform at Carcross in the morning, and here's another one at the rear. The coaches are all have open platforms on both ends, and so this is not an observation car, but just a coach that happens to be on the end of the train. These are all built in the 2000s. In the distance on the left, looking down the platform, you see where our first photo run by is going to be, which is the former swing bridge that crosses the inlet that I mentioned between the two lakes at Carcross. The bridge now fixed in place since the river steamboat traffic ended in the mid-50s, still has its original Howe timber truss superstructure, but now steel underpinning, and it's now a fixed bridge. To the right of the bridge, the reddish building is the Carcross depot, and here our Alco powered train is doing some run-bys. The peak in the distance is called Caribou Peak. Carcross is actually a contraction of the original name of the place, which was Caribou Crossing. And it and the other peaks in the Coast Range get up to about 7,000 feet in elevation. I meant to warn you that there will be some pictures without trains. And this is, we're making our way south along the long, narrow Lake Bennett. And this is the east shore, this is the west shore. Continuing along Lake Bennett. There's very little tangent track on the White Pass in Yukon. All the track that's in service is impeccably maintained. 110-pound, newish steel rail, heavy rock ballast. Even on the current north end near Carcross, they're putting in some sections of welded rail, maybe as an experiment up there, but it's all maintained to a very high standard. The section along Lake Bennett was the last to be completed, partly because it was the least urgent and because of the availability of steamboats on the lake from Bennett going north, but also because of the very heavy rock work required to carve out a right-of-way along the lake. That was, of course, true also on the climb from Skagway to White Pass. Lots of steep cliffs that had to be blasted out. We're continuing south now along the east shore of Bennett Lake, and the first station inside British Columbia is this location called Pennington. There's an abandoned depot there and an abandoned ice house where ice was once harvested from the lake. Another view across the lake. Right in the middle of the picture is a waterfall on the cliff opposite. You can see some of the fall color. So we've now reached Bennett. We've covered approximately 30 miles south. Bennett, remember, was and is the north end of the mountainous part of the railroad. It was once a very important point operationally. It was a place where helpers could be added or removed. There was and is a loop track and a Y there, allowing the rotaries to be turned or whole trains to be turned. Now it's a rather quiet place, although back in the 80s it was used as one of the major turnaround points for the excursion trains out of Skagway. We had quite a bit of time there that day to explore. There's still some remnants of the Gold Rush days and one can take a look at, but we were waiting for particularly for a meet with one of the trains, tourist trains coming up from Skagway that was apparently going to run all the way to Carcross. Here is that meet. Our own power has pulled ahead on the loop track to where it rejoins the main line, and we're meeting one of the big NRE units with its what's probably a 15-car train. Although late September was kind of late in their season, they were still, as you'll see, running plenty of cruise ship trains out of Skagway to the summit and beyond. You don't have to arrive on a cruise ship to ride in the White Pass, but that's where most of the people come from. And so I'll refer to their regular passenger trains as cruise ship trains, or I might sometimes just call them boat trains because that's where the people come from. My recollection from 1982 was that all the really good scenery was on the south side of the pass. Well, this is the north side. In fact, this picture is taken from the yard limits at Bennett. It had snowed just a day or two before, and so I think you might agree that's somewhat scenic also. During our layover at Bennett, what should appear but one of the shovel noses on a work extra with 6 gravel hoppers. Remember, these are the first units that were used to dieselize the railroad. In fact, the first 2 units were the 90 and then here the 91 that came in 1954. The Thunderbird logo on the front of them did not come from the factory. It was applied to all of them, I think, eventually by the late 50s. And the original ones I read were painted on the fronts by a guy in the shop, and they're all a little bit different. And now there's no doubt, say, a steel version that can just be applied to the front. But the Thunderbird is a Northwest Coast Indian motif. It appears in all sorts of art, such as totem poles, and it's become sort of an iconic thing with the White Pass shovel nose diesels. We're soon going to be heading back to Carcross to end that first day. This is a look north down the lake from the site of the ghost town of Bennett, where something like 1,000 people spent the winter of 1899 waiting for the ice to break up so they could continue by water to the gold fields. So it was a real city there for one winter. And since then, it's been a ghost town. Still kind of a lonely place now that's not operationally not very important to the railroad. But we'll be visiting back there a couple more times. We're now heading north now along the east shore of Bennett Lake. The spot in the distance with the embankment work underway. By the way, there's evidence of all sorts of construction improvements all along the railroad to eliminate curvature, eliminate rock slide dangers and other issues. And this spot that the train is rounding is called Guardrail, sharp curve, no doubt that's where it gets its name. I'll be showing you a picture of that spot looking in the other direction, actually taken from that place where the embankment work is being done, looking south. Here we're looking north. Here we're looking south. So day 2, we were bused all the way from Skagway. It was about a 2-hour bus trip in the morning, and the first thing we encountered at the shops, milepost 0, was the number 69, also an original White Pass engine. It was built for helper service over the hill from Skagway to Bennett, and was considered to be really big power for its day back in 1908. It was after dieselization, it went to the lower 48. It was ran in South Dakota for a while, ran in Nebraska for a while, and was a few years ago was repatriated by the White Pass and has sometimes seen use as a backup steam locomotive. It's currently out of service. The the company was cooperative enough to tow it out of the shop so we could at least take a look at it while we're there. As you can see in the lower right, it's an outside frame engine, the big counterweights outside, and which the White Pass, of course, that's very popular in Colorado, but the White Pass went away from that design because the big counterweights on the outside would tend to ride up on packed snow and derail the engines. And so you'll see the number 73, which I'll show you now, has a more conventional inside frame design. 73 was the last locomotive built for the railroad. Very late model for possibly the last narrow gauge steam engine built for road service in the U.S., 1947, and it's the pride of the railroad. During our time there at the shop, there was plenty of opportunity to get wet. It was raining steadily all day, unfortunately, kind of limiting some of the photo ops. On the right is the White Pass shop complex that was built to replace the original that was burned down in 1969, taking with it a couple of Alcos and one of the 70 class Mikados. So now we're on our way up the hill, and at a spot called Boulder, where there's a long passing track, we were passed by one of the boat trains, and during that passing, we were doing a photo run by, so you can see how long the boat trains are. The NRA diesels show no evidence of noticing that they're on a grade with a 14 or 15 car train. Very powerful engines. A little farther up the hill, you can see we had just a 4-car consist on the almost 3.9% grade from Skagway to White Pass. The 3 coaches at the end were all heritage cars built in the 1880s and 90s. You can see that we had a double tender that day, which allowed us to get over the summit and partway down the other side to Fraser without a water stop. Right behind the engine is one of the most unusual, possibly the most unusual pieces of passenger equipment on the White Pass. It's one of 2 that it originally had like that. They were both obtained from the Sumter Valley Railroad in Oregon. Came north with the Army in 1943, had cupolas added to them by the White Pass in 1946 when it took possession of them, and they're easy to spot and very quickly appear in old photos. The one surviving one is the one that we had, the 211. The 209 is no longer in that configuration. Here we're up to a place called Clifton, which is noted for its actually pair of overhanging rocks. When the blasting crews got there in 1898, they decided these rocks were out of the way enough to just leave them alone. They did. They're still out of the way. We are waiting on the main line for a meet with an upbound boat train. The equipment on the left is not our charter, but it's a downward or southbound boat train waiting to proceed to Skagway after the meet. The guy standing on the track nearest the camera is Chris Scow, the tour operator. A few miles farther up, we had a pair of meets with southbound boat trains. Here's the first one, a place called Glacier. White Pass itself is milepost 20, so we're getting quite a ways up the hill. Here's the second meet on the left, and then after that we resumed our climb toward the summit. This is possibly the most photographed spot on the railroad. It's the south portal of what is now Tunnel 1. It was once the only tunnel. You can see that immediately south or downhill of Tunnel 1 is this tall timber trestle. The picture on the right here was taken by just basically rotating during another run by to look a little bit more downhill. As you can see, we were almost totally socked in then weather-wise. Visibility was down to a couple hundred yards. And so unfortunately, from our trip that day, I can show you very little of the scenery that I remember as being so spectacular from my earlier trip. But that's the way it goes. On the right, that sheer cliff is just one of several examples of 1,000-foot sheer granite cliffs that had to be blasted out to make a shelf for the railroad. Incidentally, when the railroad was being planned in the early 1890s, experts were brought in, people that had done things like they'd built the Canadian Pacific Railroad to the Rockies, and the consultants were, when asked, were offered the opinion that building a railroad through the White Pass would be not just difficult, but impossible. But it was built anyway. We've reached the summit now.
Excuse me, Bill. I just one question I just wanted to throw in right now.
Sure.
What's the percentage grade going uphill from Skagway?
Just a hair under 3.9.
Right. Thanks.
So we're at the summit now, milepost 20, almost 3,000 feet. It's, if anything, it's raining harder. I'm up on a little hill that for one of the photo run-bys, and here's one at track level. They had time to do several there right at the summit, and here's one from up above. The picture from up above, I'm standing right on the U.S.-Canada boundary, the Alaska-British Columbia boundary, and there's a couple of flags there and another monument, which I'll show you some other views of that area later on from one of the other days. Divide is actually a little bit, about a quarter mile north and a little bit higher than White Pass itself. And this shows one of the boat trains. And this one is behind the 3001, which was either delivered or has been repainted in the more traditional yellow and green. I don't know what the railroad's plan is for repainting the others, but we got a glimpse of that uniquely painted one. We're now heading down on the north side, almost to Fraser. This is milepost 26. We're following, I think, was the drainage of the Thompson River. This is Fraser at milepost 27. It's one of 3 places currently used as turnarounds for the various boat train itineraries. One is there's a loop track to turn around at Divide. Second, there's a loop track here at Fraser for people that want a somewhat shorter than complete itinerary. And then there is a Y also all the way at the north end at Carcross. Bennett is not currently used as a turnaround point, but could be. So here we've reached Fraser with our steam charter, and in the distance is one of the shovel noses that's going to take over for the rest of our descent down to Bennett and then along the lake to Carcross. It's bringing a couple of coaches with it. It's going to rearrange our consist a little bit before departing. Here's a view, another view of Fraser. There's the original, let me go back to this. This is the original depot and covered water tank on the left. And then here's on the left in the distance is that same structure. You can see the tour buses. This is one of the points where people can continue. If they don't want to just return to Skagway by train, they can continue by tour bus on a different kind of itinerary. The ugly complex on the right is the Canadian customs facility. And on the left, the train that's waiting is a boat train ready to depart back to Skagway. So we're continuing on the descent now. We had Shovel Nose 98 was our escort, so a late model, one of the custom GEs with, of course, that nice Thunderbird logo on the front. Late in the day, everybody was soaked, at least I certainly was. My jeans were soaking. I was losing, I must say, enthusiasm for trains and train photography by this point, but fortunately we had a little bit better weather the next day. The last car here on on what was now 5 coaches was the Lake Dewey, and looking after the trip at my slide collection from 1982, I discovered that the Lake Dewey was the car I had ridden then. So I rode it this day, the next day, and then back in 1982. So come to think of it, as my private car.
Bill, if I just break in with another question, did trains across the border have to go through a customs inspection?
I think that I think not, but I'm not certain. I think they can if they're staying on the train. I don't think they have to be checked by customs. Now, if they're continuing with a tour bus itinerary, then I suspect they do, but I don't have any really definitive info on that.
Great, thanks.
So here we are back at the bridge at Carcross. This is the former swing bridge that was converted to a fixed span in the mid 50s, but still with the original Howe timber truss superstructure. So that was the end of day two, and it was time then to go find something to bus back the hour to the hotel, find something to eat, and dry out for the next day. So our third day, the last day of the Chris Scow charter, was began at Carcross again. On the left is the Shovel Nose 98 that brought our train down the previous afternoon, and then sometime that night, the railroad has brought the 73 down also. The 98 will depart first, Deadhead to Skagway with a few cars, and then we will have a full day of steam with the 73. There goes the 98 for heading for Skagway. And of course, we had some other run-bys on the bridge. I'll let you decide whether the guy next to the engine ruined the photo or not. For me, I don't think so. The reddish building, of course, is the depot that you saw earlier from a different angle. I mentioned that Mike number 73, built in 1947, was as modern, I think, as any narrow gauge engine ever got in the United States. And as to exemplify that, here is the factory equipped cloaking technology that it came with from Baldwin. Of the several run-bys on the bridge there, this is the only one where the locomotive was visible. Of course, the crew is just being cautious and keeping the cylinder cocks open while the cylinders are still cold. This is a continuation of really that same run-by as the track turns north up the lake. You can see that again we had the former Sumter Valley Combine number 211, and I think we had actually 3 or 4 coaches plus that, because the grade on the north side is less imposing than the grade from Skagway on the south side. Well, here I was sizing up a photo of an interesting mountain, and this train got in the way. Again, along Lake Bennett, going south along the east shore. The weather looked threatening, but the rain fortunately held off. So it was a much more pleasant day than our day climbing up from Skagway to White Pass. I don't know what type of tree this was that turned gold. They didn't look to me like either aspen or birch, but of something related. Maybe somebody knows the answer. We're proceeding here still along the sort of water level part along the lake or near the lake. Here's the Lake Dewey again on the rear of our train, and I said I rode it both of our steam days, as it turned out. It was built all the way back in 1881 as a wood car, still wood-bodied, but like all their other heritage cars that were wood-bodied, has been retrofitted with a steel underframe. When I rode it in 1982, it was configured as a parlor car, and but now has just standard coach seating. Continuing south along the lake. There are very few of the original White Pass freight cars that still survived. Most of them were, when the railroad switched to containers, most of them were sold off to railroads in Central or South America. For some reason, there are half a dozen cars at a aptly named gravel pit spur at milepost 55. And here's one of the nearly original White Pass box cars, came from the Colorado and Southern. May have come north with the Army, or maybe earlier. A few tank cars there also. Now, I mentioned that place guardrail earlier, and now I'm up on that embankment that you saw that was being worked on. We're looking north along the lake, and for the video guys, there's a very long photo run by along the lake here. Same spot, closer train. And now we're at the south end of Lake Bennett. We've reached the station of Bennett again that you saw before on my Alco day one. There's a pond behind the depot that was especially pretty this time of year. That time of year, September. While we was there, they had time to do a run by on. This is part of the Y, also part of the loop track, immediately behind the depot. Now we're continuing the southbound climb. Milepost 30 is still below Fraser, but climbing toward White Pass. Another view of the what I remembered as the non-scenic part of the railroad. As I said before, I think this is a bridge over the Thompson River. I see now that we did in fact have 4 coaches plus the ex-Sumter Valley Combine. Same bridge from a different angle. Again, more evidence of the early snow. As I think I mentioned earlier, it snowed for the first time just a couple of days before our charter. We've now, we're actually just above Fraser now, based on the bridge number, heading for the summit, and another view of the train. Now we're back at Divide, just on the British Columbia side of the border, in the siding, and here comes a Skagway bound boat train. There was time again for a series of run-bys at the summit. The obelisk and the 2 flags there on the hill on the right mark the international boundary. And I showed you a shot earlier from when I scrambled up that miserable hill to be able to look down on the track for one of the run-bys. A lot easier to catch the run-by from track level. We're on the left here. We're nearly at the end of the day. We ended that day at Fraser, which is partway down the hill toward Bennett. The picture of the White Pass personnel on the right is just a reminder that they were both very professional and very friendly group. You can tell who train crew were, who the engine crew were. The three civilians were all passenger department employees, and the woman on the right there in the foreground is essentially the person that runs their whole passenger operation, deals with the cruise ship operators. So that was the end of the September Chris Scow charter. And as a change of pace, and hopefully you'll find it interesting, I'm going to turn the clock back to 1982, and which was a very eventful year for the railroad. The 73 had been on static display outside at Lake Bennett for several years, along with a caboose and a rotary, and it had been taken off the previous fall, or maybe early winter, or probably the previous fall, to be restored to operating condition, which was accomplished by late winter. The idea being to try to encourage some more tourist traffic. But then in May, the hammer came down. The big lead zinc mine in Faro, the mine that the railroad was hoping to provide most of its freight traffic for many years, and the mine that was provided almost half of the GDP of the entire Yukon Territory, announced that it would shut down the next month. Now, somehow in the pre-internet days, I learned of this, and also learned that there would be a steam trip over the entire length of the railroad in July 19th. I don't know how many of those were run, that year, but it dawned on me that if I was ever going to ride the White Pass Railroad, this might be the only opportunity, because it might be gone within a few months. And it did, in fact, shut down for several years, as I said earlier, in October. So the remaining photos I'll show you are all from July 19th, 1982. There were no run-bys. We went the full 110 miles from Skagway to Whitehorse, so there really wasn't time. So mostly I have either terminal shots, but also shots of Whitehorse where there's no longer any railroad, and then some grab shots from the train, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of them. Got up early that day, and the yard in Skagway is within a couple miles of the dock and the passenger depot, and so I had an opportunity to walk up there and see what was going on. And the Alco 101 was switching some freight cars, and the tank cars there on the right are a reminder that that was essentially the only bulk freight traffic the railroad had left, was supplying petroleum products to the Yukon. You see that the Alco 101 is now in an all blue with white stripe paint scheme. If you ever see a picture of a White Pass blue diesel, you know it's from the 1980 to 82 period, because that's the only time they used that scheme. Here I was, sort of taking a locomotive picture. What I didn't realize at the time was that what was historic here was not the locomotive, but the box on the flat car. I mentioned the White Pass. It was the pioneer of North American intermodal container service, and that's one of their second generation containers there on the right. So that's actually the historic part of the photo. Getting closer to departure, I walked back down to the to the depot area, and by this time the 101 had come down to the dock area and was working a string of flat cars that were being probably loaded here with, they could be unloaded, I suppose, but I think they're probably being loaded with anything from RVs to station wagons to whatever. At that time, there was not yet a paved highway down to the coast at Skagway. So anyone that wanted to transport a vehicle over the mountains, through the mountains, could use this flat car service that the railroad provided. There's a little yard near the depot with a ramp to allow vehicles to be moved on and off the flat car, circus style. This is a view just sort of turning to the left a little bit. This is the White Pass passenger depot. On the far left is the little yard where the vehicle loading and unloading occurred. Farther to the left is the dock area in the harbor. We're getting close to departure now. You can see we had a 4-car consist that day. They were all heritage cars. I think at that time that's all they had was heritage cars, going back to the 1880s and 90s. Maybe a few more recent ones, but none of the modern steel ones that I showed you earlier. This is the north end of the Skagway yard, and here we're being passed by what looks like a passenger train, but I think it was the daily mixed northbound from Skagway to Whitehorse. I've since read that the common practice of the railroad at the time was to run a mixed each direction over the entire length of the railroad, supplemented by a few tourist trains to or beyond the summit, and or actually from tourist trains to Bennett, where they turn so over the entire hill and then back to Skagway, and then occasional freight. So we, based on my slide collection, we seem to have leapfrogged this particular train, which I interpret as the northbound mixed, on our way to. It went all the way to Whitehorse, as did we. So climbing north out of Skagway, the railroad follows the increasingly narrow, deep valley of the Skagway River. It eventually gets to about 1,000 feet above the river as it nears the pass. Here we're up to milepost 14. Remember, 20 is the summit, and this is first of what must have been several water stops during the day. Remember, that's how far the single tender got us. But fortunately, the train could stop, and I could get a decent shot from one of the platforms. So here are a couple of grab shots from the moving train, the rear platform of the Lake Dewey. On the left is the tunnel I showed you earlier, now called just Tunnel 1, and the trestle that leads out of Tunnel 1. We're maybe a couple miles in track distance below it, but gives you a little bit of feeling for the topography. Photo on the right, it was taken near this White Pass summit, and it had cleared up just enough. We can see all the way down to the ocean, and the white speck that you see below that white cloud is a ship in Skagway Harbor. Now we're over the top, all the way down the other side to Bennett, which in 1982 was a very busy place, unlike today. Looking at my slide collection, it appears that in addition to our steam special, there were 3 other trains in town. At that time, Bennett was I think the standard, maybe only turnaround point for folks that wanted to ride over the pass and return the same day, to Skagway. If you look really carefully on the left, you might be able to see that the diesel there is number 100, which was heading that, what I interpreted as the mixed out of Skagway, and that left before we did. So we seem to have been doing some leapfrogging with it. Another shot of the depot at Bennett. Looks like maybe that's the entire, maybe part of one of the trains that's preparing to head back to Skagway. The Bennett depot at that point had a sit-down lunchroom and a 45-hour layout over, so people could have a lunch and then some time to walk around and look at some of the Gold Rush artifacts. We've traversed now Lake Bennett. We're all the way north to Carcross, and this is a lucky shot from the rear platform of the Lake Dewey, showing, of course, the bridge that you've seen a number of times already at Carcross, but also the SS Tootsie, steam stern wheeler that was the last such ship to operate on the upper Yukon Lake system, retiring in the 1950s. It had been put on been beached, put on dry display. I'm sure the hope that it would be a permanent memorial, but sadly it was destroyed by a fire of suspicion origin a few years after this. So the photo, I guess, was lucky in a couple of ways. So here's our train on, I don't have to tell you where this is anymore, although I noticed from the picture that this is when the trestle still had its wooden bents and it's since been replaced by steel. But if you look straight through the bridge, you see that the Carcross Depot at that time was white. We are, unlike our charter in the September, we did not stop at Carcross. We continued north all the way to Whitehorse. Here we are just north of the Carcross Depot. You can see the white depot building above one of the tank cars in the distance. And we're meeting what I suspect was the southbound mixed train out of Whitehorse heading for Skagway. As I said, the railroad's practice at that time seemed to have been to run a mixed, the full distance each way, one northbound, one southbound, and to supplement that with some tourist trains turning at Bennett, heading back to Skagway from there, and occasional freights. You might wonder, well, if it's a mixed train, where are all the passenger cars? I would just speculate that the Combine 211, which is the one that was in service during September's charter, the one that still exists, was maybe enough to accommodate the number of people that wanted to ride north of Bennett to or from Whitehorse, and that they maybe have had the option to add some coaches at Bennett from the climb over the hill, but that's just speculation. You see that in the freight part of the consist, the train cars are pretty prominent. Well, at the end of the day, we reached Whitehorse, milepost 110 point something. Whitehorse had a nice two-story depot with log siding. The depot itself, the depot building itself is still there, but all the railroad is gone. Every bit of track. Although parts of the railroad from Carcross to Whitehorse are in place, the railroad now ends, the last bit of track, I think, ends about a mile south of the downtown area, which is where the depot was. Remember, this is the train with the 100 that preceded us out of Skagway. I don't know if it got to Whitehorse before or after us, but you can see it still has its a traditional box car that was used for baggage, and it still has at least its ex-Sumter Valley combine. While we were just hanging around the terminal waiting for the light to get too bad for photography, this extra freight appeared, and all that's visible in the consist is tank cars. And standard power was, I think then, for much of the freight railroad was still the GE shovel noses, that they seem to be more popular with the crews and maybe easier on the track than the bigger Alcos. Behind the engine here is the modest two-stall engine house at Whitehorse. Here's our train with the four coaches. The gentleman on the left is our conductor, and they're preparing to turn the train on the Y that was there to head back to Skagway at some point. Again, preparing to turn the train. There's my private car, the Lake Dewey, on the rear. Remember, as I said earlier, it was configured as a parlor car at the time, but is now a coach, dating from 1881. Another glimpse of the engine terminal at Whitehorse. In the lead there is actually the original shovel nose, number 90. Behind it, you can just barely make out a 91, and then there's a third shovel nose behind that, and then one of the White Pass's home-built steel cabooses next to the engine house. It appears that they may be preparing the engines for a night freight to Skagway. Over on the far left is some operations of the White Pass's highway subsidiary. One time, the White Pass ran a railroad, a highway subsidiary, an airline, an ocean shipping service, a pipeline, and maybe some other things I'm forgetting. It was an all-purpose transportation, company. Well, lights getting low, and that's, I think, I'll take that as a reminder that as it was time to quit then, maybe it's time to quit tonight, and I'll be happy to stay around as long as anybody has any questions or any of their own experiences with the White Pass and Yukon that they'd like to share. So if you're still there, thank you for your attention, and as I said, I'll stay around if there are any questions.
Okay, so we do have a few questions here. Let's see. First one is, what's the long-term future of the shovel-nose diesels? Are they used for special occasions or only? Are they considered special or heritage locomotives?
We were told that of course, the number of shovel noses, the number of Alcos has decreased over the years. We were told that the railroad plans to retain in operable condition two each, the two shovel noses and two Alcos. I think on the proper, I think only, as far as I know, only one of the shovel noses has been scrapped, several maybe out of service, but the railroad is down to just three Alcos. As many know, some were sold to the Durango and Silverton, and some were destroyed in the Roundhouse fire. So I think it's down to three Alcos and an unknown number of shovel noses, but apparently they plan to keep two of each serviceable as heritage units.
Right. So another question here. On your trip in September, where were the steam engine and the diesels is turned to face south?
There's several points along the railroad where locomotives or whole trains can be turned. There's a loop track at Divide near the summit. There's a loop track at Fraser halfway down the north side. You saw a number of photos of the loop track and Y at Bennett, and then there's a Y at Carcross. So there's the railroad has any number of options in terms of turning engines.
Okay. I guess we'll deal with this one in two parts. So it's the steam locomotive still fired by coal? Was it ever?
I'm not sure. It's an oil burner now, and may have been built as an oil burner.
Okay. And where's the fueling done? Is it done at Skagway or also somewhere else?
They're probably capable of fueling it at Carcross or Fraser. Both of those places are reachable by road. Bennett, there's no road access at Bennett, but its home is Skagway, and that's probably where the fueling is ordinarily done.
Is Skagway the headquarters of the railroad, and is the railroad considered a United States railroad or a Canadian railroad?
Well, it's both, and Skagway is the headquarters, and when it was originally chartered, it was in three separate governmental districts: Alaska, British Columbia, and the Yukon Territory, and had to be formed as three separate companies. And that's why in the early days, you don't see a White Pass and Yukon Railway or railroad. You see White Pass and Yukon Route, because that was the marketing term that the three companies used to when they coordinated their services.
Okay, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So again, Bill, thank you for a wonderful program, some spectacular photography. I think there's a lot of people here who are itching to get up there and ride through some of that wonderful scenery. So
let me just with that comment, Dave. Let me mention that for people that are intrigued by the idea of going on a railfan charter there, Chris Scow is doing another one this coming fall, and also Peter Lero has started to do White Pass charters. So you could check out either of those possibilities.
great. Okay, well, again, thank you very much, Bill. And at this point, we'll end the formal program.